Thank you very much. I am really excited to be here. I'm very much an admirer of Google and the work that's being done here. I'm going to go quickly through quite a bit of information. Hopefully we'll have time then for questions afterwards. This is based on work I've done throughout almost all of North America in places like the Chernobyl irradiated forests that we're worried about burning up, and in fact did this summer. The Amur Tiger Reserve in northeastern China that I've been working in, such places as watersheds in southern China, the governments of Turkey, India, and other places. So this is an amalgamation of work that we've been doing. I want to start with what I'm going to cover today is first the current situation of the forests of the world, the explicit dynamic paradigm, because many people implicitly think of forests in one way that's different than they explicitly would admit that they think of them. I'll talk about the increasing environmental use of wood, forest communities. Each of those will allude to specific technical tools. Then I'll talk about very specific technical tools that can be used here, and I hope Google will pick them up and use them. And then I will come back to community networking at the end, because I think that's important. Okay, just to start with the condition of the forests in the world, about 31% of the land area in the world is forests. That's about 3.7 billion hectares. And agriculture is about 12% of the world. The biggest threat is if more people want meat and they raise that from agricultural land, that would be a reduction in forests. Otherwise, the forest area is amazingly stable, not perfectly stable, but compared to most resources, it's quite stable, mainly because of the increased efficiency of agriculture. If we look at where the forests are in the world, most of the conifer forests are in the northern hemisphere. And that large number for Europe actually is because Russia is listed in Europe and Siberia has much of the forest, but most of the conifer forest is in the northern hemisphere. Now, most of the broadleaf forests are in the tropics, with some of it in the northern hemisphere as well. Now, what I'm showing you here is the accessible forest. There's really about twice as much forest as that, but the rest of it is either in some kind of reserve or not close enough to some place to be considered immediately available in any way. If we begin to look a little bit more closely, these are the places that are considered concerns for biodiversity. There are other places that have high concentrations of species. It's just that these are the ones that are considered concerns. I wanted to throw that out at you to get you an overview of the world. The forests are distributed in many places. There's a whole lot of them. There's a very large amount. In terms of who owns the forests, most of the forests in the world are publicly owned by the government. And that's significant in how something like Google Earth could interact with them. It makes it, I think, a lot easier and a lot more helpful. Now, we right now have about 12.5% of our forest area in reserves. They're not appropriately distributed, I don't think. Some places have more than they need compared to others that need more, even within countries and between them. The U.S. has the largest amount of reserves. About 25% of its forest is in reserves, but that's largely in Alaska and the Rocky Mountains, which are not places that are of high concern for diversity. Now, the other thing is we are really underutilizing our forests in terms of forest growth and harvest. Basically, we are harvesting only about 20% of the wood that we're growing every year in the world. That's a surprisingly small number, but I couldn't believe it when I did all the calculations, but it seems to hold quite a bit. Now, this is where the wood is in the world. This is Russia. The red shows the unharvested wood. Brazil, this is basically the amount of growth every year. This is Brazil. India is one of the few places that's over-harvesting. Now, the other interesting thing is the white is the wood that's used for subsistence fuel wood. Over 50% of the wood that's harvested is used for subsistence fuel wood. And that actually saves very little CO2 and very little fossil fuels. So basically, we're not harvesting much wood. The wood that we're harvesting is not very well used. Okay, in the United States, just to show you, this is the amount of harvest in each region of the United States. This is the amount of mortality. This is the amount of growth. So basically, even the United States, we're only harvesting about half of what we're growing. This is why you're hearing more information about fires occurring, the forest gets more crowded. There are other concerns you'll see as well. The other thing that's very interesting as countries become economically developed, a lot of the rural subsistence people leave their agriculture and move to cities. This creates some very big, serious problems in cities, but this is why we end up with actually an increase in forest area in many countries as they become economically developed. It's very interesting, the Chinese in the last 40 years have decreased their agriculture area by about 50%, and yet their food per capita that they have been growing has actually been increasing. It's the increased efficiency of the agriculture. Okay, now I wanted to set that. What we have is a general area where we have a large amount of forest area. We have a large amount of growth. It's not being utilized for very much. It's becoming very crowded in many places. And you'll see what occurs further from this. Now, I want to talk about an explicit paradigm of forests. This is a picture from the Harvard forest in 1900, when the idea was that this is a natural forest, a climax forest. It was a set aside in that the old trees would die, they would prepare space for the young trees. This is what supposedly North America looked like when the first Europeans got here. This idea of a steady state forest has ruled very much our idea of the forest left to itself will be natural in very many things to all people. Now, with this as a background, we would look at forests such as this and say that this is very typical, with these trees being older, nurturing the younger ones, and the best way to manage this forest is either leave it alone or remove the bigger trees and let the littler trees move up. This is where we have the very, now this is a very explicit statement that you'll find in the literature going up through the 1970s. Now, this is what that same Harvard forest stand looked like in 1939. This was a wake-up call that the forests are not stable. This was a hurricane that went through the area and blew down a very large area. It made people begin to change their paradigm, realize the forest is actually very dynamic. It doesn't stay stable in one condition. It keeps changing from one condition to another. In fact, by 1990, the Ecological Society of America had a symposium where they admitted this. They talked about the traditional assumption of a balance of nature. A forest moves to a mature climax stage that becomes its permanent condition, is the way they were thinking. They say that's no longer the case. As one scientist said, the balance of nature concept makes nice poetry, but it's not such good science. Now, people will explicitly admit that yes, the forest is dynamic, but then implicitly they start to think of the forest as something we want to protect, preserve. But what's the best way to do that? I want to bring that up because very often we still have this implicit assumption that this is what the forest should be. I want to just point out that the more we study them, the realize that such things as selective cutting are actually, if you only do selective cutting, degrading the forest, because the forest, these smaller trees are not younger than the larger ones. They started after a disturbance. And if you don't have the disturbance, you lose some of those trees that are in the overstory canopy. In fact, that's to the extent that we're worried about losing some species just because we are constantly doing selective cutting rather than allowing large disturbances. What we now appreciate is that the natural forest existed in a variety of what we call structures. And it moved from one to the other with a combination of disturbances and growth. And the other thing that's very interesting is there are species that depend on each of these structures. And this is a report I gave to Congress where this is a list of the species that have become either endangered or extinct because we've run out of some of the different structures. Where we clear-cut all our old growth, we had problems. Where we stopped our fires and didn't have savannas or openings, we also have problems. So if we're worried about biodiversity, what we need to worry about is all of these conditions. Now, I want to show you an example of that. This is a study I did with the Amur tiger. In northeastern China, they have a large reserve. An area was clear-cut about 40 to 80 years ago, and now they've put it in a reserve. The trouble is the forest has grown up so dense that it all looks like this. There's no tiger prey, so they don't have any tigers there. This is nearby Russian Far East where they're selective cutting, high grading actually. They've got tigers there, but when this grows up, they won't have tigers there. This is India. In this part of India, there are plenty of tigers. This is in a game area. The forest outside the game area looks like this, but they keep this one open through fires, and they have very many tigers because they have enough openings. So I want to emphasize that what we're looking at is a variety of different conditions. Now, what happens with the forest is that after some disturbance, you may have a whole lot of open structure, and then when the forest becomes dense, a whole lot of the dense structure, and your species kind of fluctuate according to how the forest grows. Now, that can be very irregular if not managed. On the other hand, if we can manage in a way, and I'll show you, that we can do different forest activities so that we create a more uniform set of structures, then we can end up creating more biodiversity. We won't have as many endangered species. Now, this is something that forestry has been operating with for somewhere around, well, 300 years, but we have technical tools now that allow us to basically plan an area so that you manage part of an area and then leave it alone, manage another part, and maybe not revisit an area for 100 years or so, so that you're always having the different structures. It's not as simple as just a straight area, but there's technical tools that allow us to work with it. Now, if we could show that we're managing a forest that way, we show that we're having a sustainable forest. The trouble is, although there are certain places in the world that are mandated to use the tools to show that they can manage that way, our certification systems don't mandate that. With all due credit to certification systems, they admit that they are a work in progress, but what we need to do if we want to say that forests are sustainable is we need to be able to say we can show you that we have a plan and that we're following it. And that's where the technical tools come in. Basically, what we're looking at is, for the forest area, having some of it where we manage on an integrated fashion to keep all the structures, and some of it where we keep as reserves. So if we have an area like this of forest, if I tell you I'm managing sustainably, what does it mean? It doesn't mean anything. What happens if we had a layer in Google Earth where you could click on it and it would show you this is our certified area? And we show you which areas we're going to enter for each 5-year period for the next 100 years and what we're going to do in it. Now, that would start to get some credibility to say, see, we're being sustainable. And I'll show you a little bit more about how we can do that. I want to say that this is becoming extremely important because people are starting to catch on to the environmental value of wood. They're starting to realize that whereas subsistence fuel doesn't save much fossil fuel, subsistence firewood, our wood pellets do save fossil fuel. But far more important than that is if we can start building out of wood, look at how much it takes 70 megajoules to make a wood I-beam. It takes, let's see, 516 megajoules to make a substitute steel beam, and it takes 800 megajoules to make a substitute concrete and steel reinforced floor. So what we're seeing is that wood is starting to catch on as a environmentally valuable building material. They're starting to make 10-story skyscrapers out of it, such as this one here with this cross-laminated timber. That one's in Melbourne. This is others. They're starting to make bridges out of it. We did a calculation that if we substituted half of the building that being done out of steel, brick, and concrete and made it out of wood, we would still not use all of the wood growth that we're growing in the world each year. And we could reduce our carbon emissions by about 22%, and we could reduce our fossil fuel by about 14%. So I see more of a demand for wood use. The issue then becomes, how do you manage your forest in such a way that if we're getting all this CO2 from the wood use, how do we manage the forest to be as sustainable as possible? And in fact, the World Bank is starting to look into this in that we've got another wrinkle with red. How do we combine the red mechanism for the standing forest with the wood products, wood coming off? And this is where we need to show that the forest is sustainable, that where we can show on a map, here's what we're going to do each time to each place. Now, forest community development is very important in here. Just very quickly, we're starting to see closing of the days when people would bring in big machinery to tropical forests, haul out big logs, often export them out of the community, leave nothing but wood that they couldn't use, but the communities could, and go away. They're starting to see more and more. Oh, by the way, the local communities don't value forests in that sense. This is in Guatemala. That's a biosphere reserve on paper. This is, in fact, where it's all been cleared. This has not been cleared because that's community forests. People value forests that have a value. Okay, we're starting to see that with technical tools such as these, small-scale technical tools, we can actually engage more local communities in the forestry. And we need a Google networking system for that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Now I want to get back to the very specific technical tools that are in various ways of being available. If you see a red line around something, it means that it's been developed, but it's very clunky. And it's the type of thing I wish Google would take over and make it much more efficient. These are, ways that we can inventory the forest with a satellite. There's several of them with various degrees of precision engaged in them, all the way from public to private ones. With full disclosure, I own a 5% interest in one of these, so I won't talk about that more than just to say that those are something very much coming online. What they give us is a tree list of what you can expect in that forest. We already have the algorithms, see my red border, that shows that from that tree list we can interpret everything to how much carbon is in there, whether there's going to be a fire or a windstorm, what habitats, what biodiversity there is. So we can interpret a lot about the condition of each forest area from this. Now, the next thing is we need to be able to project it over time. Basically, we need to be able to say it looks like this now, but if we cut it this way, how fast will it grow here? That's the only way we can be sustainable. There have been very many growth models developed in between 1960 and 2000. Unfortunately, Most of them are not supported, and the owners of them are either passed away or retired. Now, the one that holds the most promise is this FVS architecture, although there may be some European ones. The second problem with it is that every time you apply it to a new area, it takes decades and millions of dollars of data to calibrate it. Now, this is a very promising thing about Google Earth Engine. If we can go to previous satellite images and get the data from there, we can calibrate it for a new area very quickly and very efficiently. In fact, we have a Google grant. Devin Ruth, my student, is going to be talking about that, where we're looking at rangelands that way. But it will allow us to be much more efficient in our management. The next thing is transparency, sustainability. We have technical tools, see the red border, that allows us to optimize or do other more user-friendly ways of determining where do we cut what and how much and when, in order to get some type of an even flow of many of these different values. Again, that tool is there, but it's very clunky. I wish it's something that Google Earth could use more of. We can also have water models that will allow us to keep the floods down and the dry seasons up by changing the land use pattern. That's also something that could float on the same image. That's a SWOT model. That's very critical. Now, when we get back to planning this way, we could actually do a plan using those optimization or similar tools and plan how we're going to cut to maintain all those values. Now, once you have the plan, imagine being able to go to Google Earth and click on, say, I want to see if this area is certified. Yes, this is what it looks like. Now, what's the next monitoring step? This is something I want to throw out to you. Suppose you went to Google Earth and you saw that, wow, I see infrared activity here, 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 and here. That means there's probably logging. We could send somebody out to look at it. What does that mean? Well, what happens if you had you could superimpose where the planned management was? If this was in 2017, okay, that logging activity is fine because that's within the expected time frame. But what are they doing logging here in the reserve? Or in this, that they're not slated to log in for 50 years? There you could immediately pinpoint places to go and investigate. It would be very transparent. And you can also show at any period what you expect each other area to look into, if you want to look at that in more detail. Okay, now I want to get back to community networking, because this is a very critical point. There's a fellow named Scott Landis who is working in Central America, but there are other people working elsewhere, and others are inviting it, where we start with simple tools and local communities, and they begin with making parts for different components that eventually pull together as they learn how to make it better and start making everything from furniture to the blanks that we could then make for cross-laminated timber and other things like this. Now, the importance here is you don't just take the log and haul it out of either the country or out of the local community with a few people running big machinery. You keep as much of the work inside the local area as possible. The second thing you do is you notice we were sawing the woods in the field. You don't need the big trucks or the big roads to haul the lumber. You can do it with smaller, lighter on the land equipment. Now, the next thing is, as long as you're having big logs and big equipment, you have a few focal points that are mills that dictate what you can bring in. If you have people in the woods sawing, we can have more of a networking approach where you could ship things to many more different places and end up with having a much more effective rural community. And I want to show you a couple of interesting things. Did an analysis of the relationship between various things like corruption perceptions and failed state indexes. Failed state is a degree of violence in a country, and said, what's it related to? Well, very little relation to population, concentration of people, transportation, such things as this. This is the R-square values. Even population was low. What's really interesting is there's a high negative correlation between amount of corruption and the amount of internet users. And the same with failed state index. Basically, the more people are interconnected, the more they are aware of what's going on, the more effective we become. Basically, we're looking at what we're calling leapfrog technologies. If people could, working in these communities, see who has what, who could trade with what, at the same time managing these areas that are already have a plan so that we know it's sustainable for biodiversity, we could go a long way toward providing jobs, wood products, more biodiversity, more people valuing the forest for the forest itself. And I want to show you one last thing. This is actually for a state in the United States, but it's pretty well true. This is the employment in logging. If in the community you don't ship out the logs, but you do secondary manufacture, that's how much employment you get. If you go all the way to furniture, that's how much employment you get. If you are looking at the value added, this is what happens from logging, actually primary manufacturing of the log, secondary manufacture. So you're shifting more of the economic turnover back to the communities. You're keeping more people there, making them wealthy, more valuing of the forest, less of a tendency to move to the cities. Well, I hope I've stimulated some ideas here, and I'll be glad to answer some questions.
In your management strategies, like in that sustainable management, do you have any ideas about how to integrate natural disturbances that might come in and affect these management strategies?
It's a very good question. Did you hear the question? The question is, what do we do about natural disturbances? Well, those places that are already doing sustainable management, when a natural disturbance comes in, then you go back and recalculate. If you were going to log this area, not for 30 years, but log this one tomorrow, but the one that you're going to log in 30 years fell over, you substitute that one for this one. If you've lost, one big problem is if you've lost your natural or your old growth type of area, you have to find some way to do some selective cutting to try to recreate that. So it's a very dynamic thing. You have a 100-year plan, but you update it every 5 to 10 years.
Hi, I actually work at Google in Brazil, and we've been working a lot with like traditional communities as well. So I have a question about, because in Brazil, the government body, they are very negative about mixing traditional and scientific knowledge, right? So how do you think it would be a good option to bring technical, scientific news and knowledge and everything that's been discovered to traditional communities without having them to lose their main values, you know what I mean?
It's a good question. First of all, anthropologists are starting to realize that even cultures are dynamic. You can't keep somebody from wearing blue jeans even if they traditionally didn't wear them, for example. So I think the main thing to do is make these products available, not force them on it, and let them pick them up and use them in a way that fits with their tradition. So rather than force it on them, just kind of make it available. You saw that little boy making a turn wheel. Mm-hmm. The man who started that took a few knives and showed them how to make salad forks. And then he just said, come in whenever you want, make one if you want, and I will buy it. And first somebody would come in and do one because they wanted a little pocket change, and then they started realizing, hey, I can do something like this. But they adopted the technologies to their own lifestyle rather than trying to change the lifestyle.
Yeah, I'm really glad to see your discussion of the dynamism of the forest, because that helps me very directly. We're working on doing annual monitoring of tropical forests, and people are disconcerted by the fact that there's a lot of variability in densities that change from year to year for a whole series of reasons. How generalized is this view of this dynamic forest, and how do we get it more diffused in the population?
It goes back to that fern gully issue. You ask any scientist, and explicitly they'll say, of course it's dynamic. But then implicitly they start thinking, wait a minute, let's leave it alone. It takes time, but we have done research. We started out in North America and people said, yes, but that's only true there. Then we went to all the temperate forests. Then in 1992, somebody said, yes, but that's only not true of the tropics. So we did research in tropics, and the scientists pretty well accept this. It's going to take a while to filter down through all the layers of special interest groups.
I suppose a comment, I really like the idea of the network and ways of harvesting. Before I went back to university, I used to actually have a portable sawmill. I had a Peterson and a Lucas mill. And one of the things when you're out there is always, trying to work out what lumber the people are going to want. Do you cut it into 3x2s? Do you do, 4x4s, or what sort of things? So I can see a real potential in, I suppose, technology almost disrupting the marketplace there, where you can put, people that need the builders who want a certain sort of timber, I suppose, directly in touch with, the people that are milling, and they can actually make those decisions as they start to mill up the logs.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. That was a Lucas mill, you're right, from Australia. The other thing that's important is if you have less overhead in machinery, you don't have to move as quickly, and you can mill more specifically. You can cut out bad pieces of wood rather than just discard it, and you can be more careful on the land.
Hi, I am Danilo Molicone from the Forestry Department of FAO. I enjoy your presentation and giving an overview of the fact that through sustainable management of forests we can improve a lot and we can gain a lot of benefit from forests. But I will be a little bit more conscious in providing some data. For example, you were showing some data saying that we are de facto using around 1/3 of what is the wood production in the forest. But it's also true that we are losing forest. Overall in the world, even if we are using 1/3, we are losing a lot of forest still. And in general, I would like to say that country like Canada, for example, since some years, the whole overall sector of forestry is an emission. So they are a source of CO2 to the atmosphere instead to be a sink. So forest, when we manage forest, and Canada, it's an advanced country, they are already, let's say, in this concept, even if also can improve a lot. We still have to think at forest like something that help us to mitigate the climate change, not something that contributing to the changes. So if Canada is in a situation like this, and the reason why we know that Canada is like this is that we have a very strong group of scientists who is producing these numbers. And I am not sure that the same is true when it comes, for example, to my country, Italy, or to other countries like Europe or even US. So the lesson that we should learn is, okay, yes, we can do much more with sustainable forest management, but not 3 times more than like it's looked like from your presentation. So I am happy, I am a forester, to see these kind of things, but maybe you are a little bit too optimistic. This was my impression.
Well, good point. Whether we can use 3 times as much or 5 times as much, I suspect long before we start using that much, we'll have better inventories and know what the upper limit is, but it's far more than we are using right now. And I agree with you that some areas are losing forest. What's unfortunate is some of the areas that have the most biodiversity are losing the forest, whereas others are not. I think we need to accept that we can do a lot more with our forests, but exactly where that upper limit is, I think when we start to get worried about that, we can adjust more. One thing that is a safety valve is that we have an awful lot of intensive plantations coming online that people invested in expecting they needed the wood and they're just not being harvested. So basically we have even a safety valve there.
Just to make a comment that make us understand this apparent distortion, but today we have like 500,000 hectares of deforestation in the Amazon every year. So if we use all the timber that comes from this deforestation, would have somewhere between 50 and 100 million cubic meters. But the total production of logs in the Amazon today is less than 10 million. So it means that basically, even when we are clear cutting, we're just burning out the whole thing and not using the timber. So that's...
Yeah, that's true. The other interesting thing, when somebody mentioned we lost 1 million hectares of Amazon forest, to me the concern is that we lost it in the Amazon, but 1 million hectares is 0.025% of the forests in the world, which is, as a global scale, it's not much. The fact that it's the Amazon, I think, is a concern.
So when you make a calculation for total global wood production and you were to kind of start to imagine what fraction of that total production could be utilized in, for wood products, there's also an enhancement in wood productivity that's the result of CO2 fertilization. And then there's that service being provided in reducing atmospheric CO2 by that. And so what about kind of, well, the trade-off there, and how do you kind of maintain that service? Well, I mean, is that included in the calculation of what total fraction of wood production can be utilized in the kind of commercial sector? Or?
Okay, what you're asking is, what does this do to the CO2 stored in the forest?
Well, no, so that there's actually a slight increase in productivity year after year after year. But now we've got a significant larger fraction of total wood production that's actually the result of elevated CO2, whereas you didn't have that fraction, let's say, 40 years ago. So it's not just what's the wood production, but also there are these two services that are being provided to the commercial sector and the sink. Is that actually part of the overall calculation about the availability of
wood? No, I didn't even calculate any CO2 fertilization of growth rate. One problem with our forests is we're harvesting so little of it that so much of it is so old that we're getting almost as much mortality as we are growth. So we're not even reaping our mortality from the forest. So we're not really taking a very strong advantage of any potential fertilization. I did, however, calculate, there's a paper I could give you the reference to on this. I calculated basically at what age for a forest, of different forests, you would want to go and harvest it so that you get maximum sequestration in the forest in addition to the amount that you would get in the products. So that's where certification would help the forest be sure that it's managed at that level, which is also a long enough rotation to maintain the biodiversity.
It's a very interesting way to think about forest and the way that in terms of the importance of management. But I'm thinking about Brazil right now and the way that we are dealing with our forest currently in terms of logging, selective logging. We have decreased a lot of selective logging activities in the past 10 years, 15 years. And right now we have a totally different trend in the construction in Brazil. Like most of, I guess, people are preferring to have their houses made by, I don't know, concrete and also planted forest, wood from planted forest. And I was wondering how that impact your numbers, because it's a totally different way of thinking and excluding management of natural forest.
Good point. The first thing is there are some cultures that traditionally don't build out of wood, but we see that that's changing quite fast because the wood, among other things, saves so much fossil fuel that it's getting to be much cheaper than other ways of building. And some of this wood construction is very sound and very strong. My big concern, and this is where I hope Google steps up quickly, is if we have this big trend for wood use without somebody being able to get control of the forest to be sure that we know how that it's maintained sustainably while we're harvesting the wood, then we could really lose our biodiversity. So rather than getting into a logger's head of saying you shouldn't build out of wood and preserve the forest versus, no, I'm going to build out of wood, I'm afraid that people are going to build out of wood anyway. We need to get the forest organized in a way so that we maintain the biodiversity while that's being done. It's doable. It's just a question of us doing it.
So you mentioned work that Devin is doing. Can you just give a real broad overview of the various projects you're doing with Earth Engine?
Yep. We're actually, I'm also doing work on the high plains grasslands of Wyoming at the request of one of our alumni, and he's doing some of that support, but we've been working with Google Earth and gotten a couple of Google Earth grants. One of them so that we can identify from satellite imagery where the leafy spurge is. That's a plant that's poisonous to the cattle, so that we could be, any rancher could go out, identify where it is, and find ways to eradicate it. We've gotten a second one where we're now using the repeat satellite imagery to see what's the change in the grasslands. The ranch we're working with did a change from the traditional grazing to pulse grazing about, when was it, 1990? And we're going to look at old and new satellite imagery and see if we can detect a change in the density and what that means in terms of the species and such as that. So it's two great projects that'll allow us to actually be able to bypass a heck of a lot of time in data collection by using repeat satellite imagery to forge some of our potential change models. Thank you.